739 is the number for you to call to support the show that provides you with the news and analysis you don't get anywhere else. I want to thank Ibrahim from Chantilly, Virginia, 202-588-9739, 1-800-222-9739, $870 to go. We can do it, but only if you just take a moment and call and invest in the show that you rely upon. 202-588-9739, 1-800-222-9739. You're tuned to member-supported radio, WPFW, Washington.
Welcome to On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller. Joining me in the studio this morning is Aldon Nielsen. Aldon Nielsen is the George and Barbara Kelly Professor of American Literature at the Pennsylvania State University. When Aldon lived here in D.C., he was the first winner of the Larry Neal Award for Poetry. How are you doing this morning,
Pretty good.
Aldon?
Glad to be back.
Great. And joining us on the phone is Laura Vrana. Laura, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Laura Vrana is an assistant professor of English specializing in African American literature and poetry at the University of South Alabama. Nielsen and Vrana are the editors of the new book, The Collected Poems of Lorenzo Thomas, recently published book by Wesleyan University Press in Connecticut. Lorenzo Thomas was born in Panama in 1944. He came to the U.S. in 1948. He was the author of several books of poetry. Two titles were Chances Are Few and Dancing on Main Street. Lorenzo Thomas was also a critic and was the author of Extraordinary Measures, Afrocentric Modernism, and 20th Century American Poetry. Lorenzo Thomas died in 2005. This morning, Aldon Nielsen and Laura Vrana are going to be joining me talking about the work of Lorenzo Thomas. And during this hour here at WPFW, we will be trying to raise $600. The number here at the station is 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. And Miyuki, are you there? Yes,
I'm right
I
here.
think you are there.
Yes, I am.
The wonderful Miyuki Williams. She will be helping me pitch this hour. We're trying to raise $600. What would you like to say as we begin this show, Miyuki?
I would like to say that it is an exemplary show, that you do in-depth and wonderful interviews. You have fascinating guests, and I know that people really appreciate it and appreciate the good work that you do, and that they will call 202-588-9739 and demonstrate their support for you and WPFW and poetry and the word in general.
Okay, and we have a pledge from an anonymous already for $100, so we can put that down. Okay, now let me get into this book, Aldon and Laura. I have a copy here, and this is radio, as Miyuki just reminded us. It's not television.
For those watching in black and white.
That's right. So you can't see the cover. But I want to begin with the cover, Laura and Aldon. This is the collected poems of Lorenzo Thomas. And we have on the cover work by John Biggers, Four Sisters. And John Biggers was who died in 2001, lived in Houston, Texas, same way with Lorenzo Thomas. We can take his work back to, I guess, the Harlem Renaissance as a muralist. Talk about the relationship between Biggers and Lorenzo, and maybe also link it to the last poem in your book.
Yeah. Well, I also want to mention the connection of all this to Laura and I, as Laura remembers all, very well. The building that houses the English department at Penn State, when you walk in the main door, you find yourself standing between two John Biggers murals, because he got a doctorate in art education there back in the 1950s. So it was really intriguing to us when we discovered that late in life, Lorenzo had written this poem that appears in the back part of the book, because down in Houston, Texas, I think it was when he first got there at Texas Southern, they met. John Biggers was teaching down there, and Lorenzo had just come to teach there, and they became quite good friends. And this poem actually appeared in the newsletter of the school where Lorenzo was teaching, the University of Houston downtown. The way that we found out about it was he read it out loud in a reading that's recorded and available on Penn Sound. And when Al Filreis wanted to do one of the Poem Talk series, he picked that poem, and nobody had a copy. So we managed to find this newsletter that had a copy of the poem and a picture of the mural that it was responding to. So it was very important that we get Biggers on the cover here.
When did you and Laura meet?
Laura,
Laura, you answer that question.
Do you know the actual year?
Yes, absolutely. I I began graduate school at Penn State. I'm going to reveal my age, I suppose. But perhaps the extraordinary. In fall of 2011, pretty specifically, honestly, to work with Aldon, knowing what my research interests were in African American poetry and poetics, and that he would be potentially a fantastic, advisor and mentor in that field. And then we immediately developed a pretty strong working relationship during my years in graduate school at Penn State, which is when this project of co-editing actually kind of began.
You should also probably mention the name of a particular professor you had as an undergraduate.
Which particular professor? I was encouraged in part to attend graduate school at Penn State by a couple of undergraduate faculty members as well, including Robert Steptoe and Elizabeth Alexander,
we know those names.
Yes.
who helped my interest in African American poetry and poetics and my knowledge of that field to, grow and flourish. And I believe it was in a class with Robert Steptoe where I first encountered Lorenzo Thomas, perhaps.
Well, Laura, talk about how, you have this interest in African American, specifically Lorenzo Thomas. Why his work? What appeals to you?
I have, for a long time, at least since my undergraduate education, had a strong affinity that overlaps with Aldon, certainly for poets who don't seem to get the attention and recognition that their work seems on its own merit to deserve. And certainly many of the kind of better-known names in African-American poetry also merit the attention that they have deserved. But Thomas, to me, among other poets that I'm especially interested in, has always also stood out as someone who was really key in a lot of ways, both kind of institutionally connecting other poets, helping forward both aesthetics and kind of movements and things, and just whose work is absolutely rich and fascinating on its own terms. But until, we hope with this collection, so much of the work was not widely available.
Well, let me ask you this question, Laura, and also Aldon, okay? If I didn't know who Lorenzo Thomas was, and I did a little Google, it would probably lead me to the Poetry Foundation website or whatever. Yep. And there you will see 3 poems, okay? Yep. Inauguration, The Leopard, the Roman numeral poem 2713 and a half. Those are the 3 poems. Now, you and Aldon are the editors of the collected poems. When you look at these 3 poems that the Poetry Foundation is putting up on their site, is that the best poems representative of Lorenzo Thomas's work? If you were keeping the website going, would you take these poems down and put others up?
Well, I would put many more up.
Exactly.
Each one is representative in its own way, but just the 3 together don't give that good a picture. The Leopard is actually a satire. If people go online, they can find a...
Okay, hold on one point, right? Mike, can you play that? Okay. Mike's going to play that.
Let's see. This is a poem. Let's see. For a long time, Dr. Tuma mentioned Umbra, and Umbra was an interesting workshop, young man in New York City, and all these guys were really very smart. They had read everything. We had discussions about William Butler Yeats and T.S. Eliot and Percy Bysshe Shelley, like we knew who these people were. and we felt that we had studied, we had good teachers, and we loved poetry, and we felt that we had inherited this grand tradition of English poetry. And so we went all over town reading our poems. And because we felt we had inherited this grand tradition of English language poetry, we were fond of using Anglo-Saxon words, which seemed part of the tradition. But then all these people say, oh, here come the foul-mouthed black guys again. Because they apparently didn't like Anglo-Saxon words, and they were short words, all 4 letters. So I said, well, this is not going to work. No one respects you this way. And then I did some research, and I found the only black poets that anyone respected were poets in Africa or someplace who wrote in French and whose work was translated badly, actually, by university professors in the United States. I said, this is it. So I determined to write poems that sounded like they were bad translations of African poets. So this is still like the leopard, but no, not the leopard, it's the leopard. The eyeballs on her behind are like fire, leaping and annoying the space they just passed, just like fire would do. The ground have no mouth to complain, and the girl is not braver herself. She is beautiful in her spotted leopard ensemble. Heartless so. To keep her fashionable in New York, leopards are dying. Crude comments flutter around her at lunchtime. She sure looks good. She remembers 9 vanishing speeches. More powerful than this is the seam of the leotard under her clothing. Her tail in the leotard is never still. The seam, she feels it too familiar on her leg, as some crumb says something suggestive. The leopard embracing around her is too chic to leap and strike. Her thoughts fall back to last semester's karate. Underneath, the leotard crouches up on her thighs. It is waiting for its terrible moment. But I'm here to tell you that that did not get over either. It's a struggle.
Listening to the poetry of Lorenzo Thomas. Alden or Laura, you want to comment on what we just played?
We don't have time to talk about all 3 of those poems and not even this one in depth. But despite the fact that this is a satirical poem, it really tells you something crucial, and that's about the importance of the negritude poets to this whole generation. Elsewhere, you find copious references to Césaire and Senghor all through here, as you would in Jane Cortez or Amiri Raga. And, for example, there's his adaptation of Leon Dumas's Hiccups that's in here that's quite uproarious as well. So, even though these poems might not be the most representative of Thomas in general, they will send you off to some really interesting context for his work.
Laura, you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do give you a hint, a small taste of some of the range that I love in his work in terms of the kind of mixture between that kind of irreverent parody versus, also that being often very frequently juxtaposed in the same works with, what we might consider more kind of immediately serious political commentary, juxtaposed with kind of all of this range of aesthetic influences he's bringing together. But it's, only the kind of tiniest taste of that range. Mm-hmm. So in terms of some of the especially, visually experimental work and things like that he was so invested in, that's so rich to explore, that is, not represented in in just a few selections.
Well, thank you, Laura Vrana, for making that comment, which makes me think about WPFW, and it's what we try to do here on the Margin, and that is to have this sort of range of people like yourself, other poets and critics come in and talk about American literature. If you want to hear continue hearing, listening to programming like this, the number to call is 202-588-9739, 202-588-9739, and make a pledge to WPFW. It's your help that keeps this show on the air. I want to ask you a question, Laura, about something that appears in the your opening comments in the book. You talk about the difficulty of locating the poetry of Lorenzo Thomas. How were you and Aldon able to put this collection together? What did you have to go through? A lot of small press journals?
Absolutely. And I will give Aldon, significantly more credit for some of that.
Oh, no, don't do that on the air.
Certainly.
Your check is in the mail.
Because he, in terms of kind of the stages of careers that we were at, I, especially when we were first beginning the labor of the project, when I was still a graduate student, Aldon, fortunately, over the course of his long career as both a poet and a critic himself, has developed these magnificent, connections across the country.
Okay, let me interrupt you there. I want to talk about, for somebody who is interested in putting together a collective work, I want you to be very specific into how do you begin? Okay, we know we're going to look at Lorenzo Thomas. What do we do? And you're not doing it by yourself. You have a co-editor.
Yeah.
So how is the work distributed? Where do you begin?
Yeah, so of course you start with Lorenzo. With Thomas, there were a couple of, the collections still in print to a certain degree, things that were still available. So that was kind of an easy entry beginning point, right, for especially as a graduate student. And thinking from there, I think about work that was not as immediately available was provoked, at least for me, in part as someone with less experience in that kind of work, by looking at interviews with him and folks who had known him and worked with him to start to get a sense of what are the types of, journals and small press outlets and things that I might at least have not been aware of that he was also publishing in, right? So if you can get a sense from the poet's own, interviews, and from the kind of circles that they were moving in, where else their work might have circulated that doesn't, immediately pop up in terms of stuff that's still widely available in print. That can start to send you down the fun detective route of finding some of those, less easily, readily still in print.
So let me throw out two names to you to see if you guys interviewed them. I know somewhere Lorenzo Thomas thanks Simon Cortez. And I was wondering whether you talked to him. And then I have here, and Aldon's in the studio with me, I have a copy of Jambalaya, and this was edited by Steve Cannon, who died last year. Yeah. But this is a Reed Cannon Johnson. And I know that, when you talk about it's Ismail Reed, it's Steve Cannon, it's Joe Johnson. I was wondering whether you interviewed Joe Johnson.
No, in fact, I never even met Joe Johnson. We didn't really conduct interviews in this process, whereas I have interviewed people with regard to essays I might be writing about this work and so forth. But I do want to say, for anyone who's thinking about a project like this, one of the most important things to do is to let everybody know you're doing it, because you need all the eyes out there you can. And two people who are named in our acknowledgments that I want to mention here, Jean-Philippe Marcoux up in Quebec, who was just here for a conference, and David Grundy over in the UK, are both doing really intensive research on the Umbra group. And both of them helped dig up some of the poems that were never collected in books. And,
well, let me ask you that. I'm glad you say that, because in a bio note here, Lorenzo Thomas says he's one of the founding members of Umbra. Is that correct?
Well, he was one of the first. When it comes to who, founding's kind of a weird word with a group like Umbra.
Let's begin with the founding of America.
But as the group coalesced, right. Let's put it that way. as I recall, Lorenzo was the youngest. He was probably 18 at the time. And Lloyd Addison was probably the oldest. And then the rest were sort of strung out in between in some way. Well, they were poets. Of course they were strung out.
So being the youngest, okay, means he would probably be susceptible to the other people around him. And I was wondering, when I see the work that he's reading, like Hazrat Inyat Khan, somebody like that, I think of Roland Snellings, who would become Eskil Muhammad Touré, whether that sort of Eastern influence begins to sort of permeate there.
Well, they all knew each other. When you ask Reed about this kind of thing today, he'll make all kinds of separations. He'll say, you'll ask him about black arts. He'll say, well, they were uptown, we were downtown, and that kind of thing.
Right.
Felt very different back in the 60s. And of course, Lorenzo enters the Navy and is just off the scene for 4 years while a lot of other developments are going on, and then comes back and goes to Houston. In fact, I can't remember if it was Dent. Somebody, when Lorenzo was trying to decide whether to take the job in Houston or not, said, if you do that, you won't be known as a Southern poet. You'll be an unknown poet.
Sounds like Tom Dent to me.
Yeah, but all of that, it probably was Tom, but all of that was in the mix for Lorenzo. But again, when you look at his, as someone who was only a little bit younger than Lorenzo Thomas and a minute younger than you, actually I might be older than you by a minute, I'm not sure which it is, but anyway, it's striking how formed his work was even in his teenage years. He and Ted Greenwald, New York experimental poet, were fast friends from high school on. And everyone talks about this, that, Lorenzo didn't seem to have that period of searching for a style that so many of us go through along the way. He seemed to be right there from the very beginning.
Well, when you talk there right there from the beginning, and you talk about Umbra, and we're looking at this relationship between the different writers, right. I'll go back to this book here, this anthology, Jambalaya, which is the work of Fulani Davis, Sins Darko, Mustafa. The introduction is by Victor Hernandez Cruz, who's another member of Umbra. Yeah. And when we talk about styles and stuff, Cruz style, is very interesting. And I was wondering whether, there's another strong influence on Lorenzo Thomas, especially when we talk about this is a guy who's looking at the work. Yeah. And is going to, for this anthology, is going to write an introduction.
Well, there again, New York is almost as interesting as D.C. in this
That's what they say in New Jersey. They look over at New York and they say it's just as interesting as East Orange.
Yeah, but there's that Dylan song, "Goodbye New York."
Hello, East Orange. Yeah.
But anyway, he's in the midst of this Caribbean / Latina communities of writers, and everyone's flowing in and out. We hadn't reached the point yet where everyone was at a different university teaching creative writing. So they all met in the cafes and the bars and so forth and so on. And there was kind of a united front of artists too, because the painters, you really see this in someone like Thulani Davis and her connection to the music world. The painters, the musicians, the poets were all hanging out together, which is a little bit less true in other parts of the country.
Well, talking about hanging out together, you and Laura Vrana are hanging out together because you put together this anthology, The Collected Poems of Lorenzo Thomas. Laura, in the preface, and I want to expand from Lorenzo Thomas to poet to Lorenzo Thomas to critic, in your preface you write that Lorenzo Thomas' book, Extraordinary Measures, was indispensable. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think generally as a contribution to the field of African American literary studies, and to anybody who's kind of interested in 20th century and contemporary Black authorship, that work that he's doing in Extraordinary Measures of thinking about the relationship between kind of modernism as more, classically defined, and African American literature as so frequently sort of defined as somehow in opposition with each other, right? Is just incredibly helpful for, contributing to some of what Aldon's talking about of maybe helping to shift our thinking to see all the ways that writers that we tend to think of in American literature as having moved in kind of different circles or things like that.
Okay, well, if I'm moving in this circle,
conversation,
right? If I'm moving in this circle, and I follow what you said about Extraordinary Measures, Afrocentric Modernism and 20th Century American Poetry, a book written by Lorenzo Thomas, how does this compare to his other book that comes out after, I think, even after he's gone, Don't Deny My Name?
Yeah, Words, Music,
and the Black Intellectual Tradition. Now, how does that? Is that like the balance of his career?
Well, he had a lot more to do. This is one of the sad things. But that book was left in manuscript. It had already been contracted with University of Michigan Press, and myself and Julius Lobo, who was a grad student at Penn State at the time, edited it and made it publishable. And that, of course, takes the music connection much farther. Includes, Lorenzo had actually gone to Arkansas and interviewed the guy who ran the radio station Sonny Boy Williamson was on, and done all that kind of work. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about Houston music as well. So the two books, I think the second one is indispensable as well, but there's sort of two different halves of Lorenzo's work as a critic. Well, I shouldn't say halves, maybe thirds, because he also edited a volume on teaching African American poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Aldon, you just said that, and it leads me to ask you a question regarding estates, because I believe you are
touchy subject.
But many times you deal with estate. Perhaps you are best in terms of how much unpublished stuff did Lorenzo Thomas leave behind?
Well, this is why it's a touchy subject. Ever since this happened, I've been telling even the youngest poets I know, make sure you have in writing exactly what you want to have happen with everything, just in case something happens. I serve as the literary executor along with Cecilio Thomas, Lorenzo's brother. And in asking me to do that, Lorenzo specified that the two of us were supposed to determine where his papers went. They haven't gone because somebody else got all of his papers from his office, so that person's family still has them. I do not have the funds to go to Houston and hire an attorney and try to get them back. I'm hoping that the family who now has them, this original person is now deceased, will agree to turn them over to us so we can make some sort of determination. I don't care if...
How much work are we talking about?
I'm not even sure about that. Fortunately, the person who was his dean at University of Houston downtown made a list, but it just tells you what kind of thing it is, not how much of it there is. And for example, those of us who worked with Lorenzo at conferences know that he always spoke from index cards, so there must be decks of these index cards, probably enough for another book of criticism, but since I don't have them, I don't know. So again, writers out there, make sure you are very specific about who gets your papers and what happens to them.
Who gets your papers, Aldon?
Well, I haven't followed my own advice. There's just me and my wife Anna Everett, and she can decide that stuff, I suppose.
No, but let's look at this.
And they should go somewhere. They should go to DC.
Right. You might recall, and this is
the GW project.
No, well, the project I did with you of trying, after I did the Charles Johnson project, I felt, we sometimes talk about the Lorenzo Thomas, we talk about the creative art. The critics are so important in terms of how did they develop. Okay, like for example, Laura, what she mentioned this morning is about, okay, she was your student, and she learned. Well, that's critical. Yeah. Whatever, if she has your course outline from some class she took.
I'm not sure anybody has that.
Aldon.
See, she probably does.
It's all saved in
the evidence is out there.
The Vrana archive.
Right.
But yeah, I've thought, back when I was still here and teaching at Howard, you and I were both involved in that project of, getting Washington writers to put things at Gelman Library, GW. And that's one possibility. Sure. But, I'm not retired and I'm not sure where I'm going to wind up. So,
Well, Aldon and Laura, these become very important questions in terms of not just in terms of story, but the fact that, if we have things are recorded, what are they on? Cassettes, reel to reel. And also we're talking about if we do give our collections to someplace, we're talking special collections. We're talking many times special collection librarians have to fight in terms of budget. Yeah. We recently saw, for example, Sterling Brown's family, taking material and going from Howard to Williams College.
Right.
And so, I wanted to have you discuss these type of things using Lorenzo Thomas as an example, because this is what I've been trying to do here on the Margin, is sort of take our listeners behind the making of literature.
Well, I should mention, not to point people to an alternative source, but I've been slowly putting a lot of the recordings I've made over the years on the Penn Sound website that Alphil Reese operates out of the Kelly Writers House up there at the University of Pennsylvania, including some of the panels that Lorenzo and I were on together. There's one, I can't remember if I put it there or not, when Lorenzo and I spoke about Sterling Brown, and Lucille Clifton was right there at 8:30 in the morning because she'd been one of Sterling's students. So there is quite a bit of Lorenzo already there, and we'll probably add more.
Well, let's add a little bit of Lorenzo before we go to our break. And if you, Aldon Nielsen, if you could read the poem Robert Williams, Exile in Cuba.
Say, ¿Qué pasa to Nicolas Guillen, Wilfredo Lam? Tell him I say hello. Look in the streets for a dark boy. Look where the students hang out, a dark boy with 3 strong hairs on his dry chin. Find him and say, quote, Lorenzo's in New York this winter, and, he's black too. Lorenzo, born in Panama, could look from his playpen, see the Canal Zone, the Stars and Stripes, could see Uncle Sam's guns aimed at the Nazi. Lorenzo, flying to the States in 47, stopped over in Havana 1 hour, remembers little, end quote. It's snowing. People pass me on the street in their long, flashy coats, sheepskin, green loden, shades of brown, black, dark loam. My knowledge of distances, these colors burn and crunch against each other. Measurements crumple. Hands jammed into big pockets, fleece maws. They follow the dog chain breath, and their warm, thick pile coats cradle unenvied burdens. Dust, washable dyes, traces of hamburger served on day-old buns. They say to me, it's not so bad up here. You bitch too much. New York City, this enlightened liberal year. My coat is even black. It's not North Carolina. Hey, Williams, Edgar Hoover's got no price on me. But someone has. Nobody held my granny in the kitchen, but I speak Ingles with a Harlem tint. And that's not advantage, man. Do I need to talk about the way they crush me walking the street in their long coats? Williams, find that boy. Tell him in Spanish. Lorenzo's in New York. It's snowing. He sits in a warm room, going blind.
You were just listening to Aldon Nielsen reading one of Lorenzo Thomas's poems from the collected poems of Lorenzo Thomas, edited by Laura Vrana and Aldon Nielsen. We're going to take a little break here. We're in the middle of our fundraising drive. I hope that you enjoy listening to Laura and Aldon and would like to make a contribution to WPFW. The number here to call is 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. The show is On the Margin. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.
Hi, I'm Joseph Green, and this is your WPFW Social Justice Calendar for the Washington metro area. Thursday, February 27th, is Defending Black America, a raw law people's practicum deconstructing interconnections between law and political motivation, reality and myths associated with representing and defending black people in the criminal justice system. 6:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. at the Institute for Policy Studies, 1301 Connecticut Avenue, Northwest, 6th floor. For more information, visit the webpage ips-dc.org/raw law defense or call 202-787-5229. Sunday, March 1st, the film The Truth Lost at Sea will be shown, and Mubarak Awad, founder of Nonviolence International, will moderate a Q&A discussion, 2 p.m. at the Washington National Cathedral, 3101 Wisconsin Avenue, Northwest, D.C. For more information, visit voicesfromtheholyland.org. Tuesday, March 3rd, is the book talk and signing for The Young Lords, A Radical History, with author Johanna Fernandez, about the rise and fall of the street gang turned political organization that led predominantly poor and working class Puerto Rican youth to confront race, class inequality, and U.S. foreign policy. 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at 5th and K, Bus Boys and Poets, 450 K Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. For more information, visit busboysandpoets.com. For an online listing of these events, or if you like your social justice event included in the social justice calendar, visit the webpage ips-dc.org/social justice calendar, where you will find submission guidelines. The social justice calendar is a public service brought to you by the Institute for Policy Studies in partnership with WPFW, your station for jazz and justice.
Okay, we're back on the margin, and joining me in the studio this morning is Aldon Nielsen. Aldon Nielsen is the George and Barbara Kelly Professor of American Literature at the Pennsylvania State University. And joining me by phone is Laura Vrana, and she is an Assistant Professor of English, specializing in African American literature and poetry at the University of South Alabama. I want to focus on an issue that affects a number of writers in terms of African American literature, and that are African American writers like Yusuf Komunyakaa, Lamont Steptoe, who are affected by being in the military, and also the Vietnam War. What impact did that have on Lorenzo?
Well, I would encourage people to read the section of this book called Fit Music, which grows out of that experience. He didn't really talk about it a great deal in later years. Now, I did not know him back then because I was, 18? I first read his work in Blackfire, and by the time I saw him again in Hoodoo, he was already back from Nam. But Reed claims that a different Lorenzo Thomas came back than the one who went over. Now, again, given the age at which people go off in the military and come back, that is not terribly startling, and it's true of a lot of people. Both Lorenzo and Lamont, clearly adjusted much better than some people we've known. Right here in the streets of Washington, I knew a lot of Vietnam vets that had really difficult times. And, partly because Lorenzo's writing and his dedication to movements and so forth, he was able to surmount whatever effect it was. But also, he was never in frontline combat. He was in the Navy. So, yes, it was dangerous, but he didn't have the experience that would cause shell shock or something like that.
But he did have an attraction to the Vietnamese language.
Yes. And in fact, he's translated several poems from the Vietnamese, a couple of which have appeared here and there. Yeah.
Okay. If I move from fit music, and this is, I'm going to talk to you, Laura, as a teacher, how would you teach or how would you explain the section called Sound Silence that's in this collection?
Sound Science.
Sound Science.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I think that's a great one to talk about, in part because we do so frequently, not feel certain as teachers how to approach some of the the types of work that someone like Lorenzo was doing. I think especially in terms of some of the visually experimental work that he's putting forth. It was such a kind of such a fun journey to make sure we were representing as well as we could in the anthology, in the collection. But yeah, Sound Science, I think, probably stands out to you and to many readers in terms of the sort of some of the much shorter verses, in terms of the some of the brevity of what's happening in those poems, and what are the kind of different types of statements that he's making, and some of that.
Well, you have a statement that you include in the back of the book. Statement for John Block, which talks about the sound science. Would that be something that you would introduce a class to first, and then the work?
I think it probably depends to some degree on what level of students are we exposing to Thomas's work. Where are they in their journey with poetics? So I think I tend with students who maybe are not going to feel as comfortable with poetry that doesn't look the way they're used to on the page, whatnot. Maybe students who are earlier in undergrad or younger levels to use that type of stuff as helpful context, and I think that can give folks a little bit of a lens into kind of where was the poet's head coming from, and maybe can also help us. I think what's so useful about having these few artist statements included in the collection is that it can also help us think about where else can we turn, as Aldon was mentioning, in terms of influences and other poets that'll help give us further context. What kind of poets or other poems or excerpts can we put alongside something like Sound Science to help us start to think about it and help us start to understand what he's trying to do with that, with that particular section.
I might add that the original publication of Sound Science featured on the cover a picture of exactly the kind of high-level tape deck that Navy guys would bring back from Asia. So in a class today, I'd have to tell them what a tape deck is. Okay.
Well, to also tell our listeners more about the work of Lorenzo Thomas, Aldon, if you could read two poems, A Tale of Two Cities and also A Mingus Memory.
You had to pick the one with the words I can't pronounce. I should mention this poem grows out of Lorenzo having read an article in the New York Times about the pro-independence rebellion in Cameroon. So it begins with an epigraph from the New York Times, 25 February 1960. Quote, "They were like wild animals," said Monsieur Jumezi. That's just the first of many things I can't pronounce in here. "Oh, the wild dancers, the New York beer drinkers running amok at the UN, shouting, 'You've crucified our saintly Lumumba.' And what about the people's other saints in Brooklyn? Do storefront churches worship a storefront God? And elsewhere, are there rites? Riots? How does the mask fit elsewhere on this fraud that we call life? The Times says nights in Cameroon are terrible. Young intellects, old madmen, philosophers, and poets machete the non-believers of their political voodoo. Who are their saints? What are their rituals? Who sings their hymns? George Beverly Shea or Clara Ward or good old Charlie Mingus? My friend, their ritual is death, and their hymns are marching songs, and the groans of their victims. General Momi Gang 5 million soldats. Should have had someone who could read French. Yoande Bassa Grassfield. The screams of victims, Mr. Mingus, Yoande, Yoande, Yoande. That's the capital of Cameroon.
And that is Aldon Nielsen reading the poetry of Lorenzo Thomas, and now he'll read of Mingus' memory.
Yeah. Test. You don't know what love is. But there is so much. Or craziness. Noise in the club, tinkling of glasses. No, he said, cash register ringing. And the cats who was there, Eric, Danny, Ted Curson, Lonnie Hillier, maybe. Eyes. Everybody says, huh? Finally he shouts it out, what love? As probably he should did in the first place. You don't know you are, and you are not living up to your potential.
What is this connection between Thomas and Mingus?
Well, all of us of a certain age have that. I can't even remember the first time I heard Charles Mingus. But also Mingus had this affinity for poets and poetry. If you've listened to the complete Mingus, you've heard some of his own writing, things like Fables for Falbus, and he would often recite poetry. For example, the famous town hall concert, he recited that poem that starts out, having to do with the mule and so forth. So on the one hand, Mingus was a poet himself. He was a great lover of poetry. He was a great supporter of poets, but also he's just one of the most inventive musicians of the 20th century, with huge ambitions that were not fully realized until they sort of assembled a symphonic version of it at the end of his life.
Right, and I think Mike's is going to play us some Charlie Mingus from the 1957 album, The Clown. Mm-hmm. That was Mingus. And if you
one thing I love about this poem, it puts you in the club. It's like you hear snatches of conversations. And Mingus shouted at his band members. It was really intimidating. On the Monterey concert, he actually sends the whole horn section backstage to get their part right, and they come back and do it over again.
You see, and what we do here, Aldon, we go from Mingus to Miyuki. And Miyuki's here, right? Miyuki, you want to make a little pitch for us?
I want to say that it's a fascinating conversation, and people are really engrossed in listening to it. And encourage them to call 202-588-9739. I want to thank Diane in Washington, D.C., who started us off. We have a goal now of $550 between now and 10 a.m., and that is absolutely doable. But it's critical that if you're listening and enjoying this fascinating, pithy, intellectual, and musical conversation as much as I am, that you call and make sure that it is supported. 202-588-9739. 1-800-222-9739. It's critical that each show hit its goal. Each show is assigned a specific amount of dollars that it has to make in order for the station to reach its overall goal. So we're waiting to hear from you. 202-588-9739. Ethelbert, you guys are wonderful.
And I want to say this, Miyuki didn't say poetry, Aldon and Lauren. She said pithy. And that's our word for
We're
today.
We're some pithy intellectuals here, up in here.
You all are doing it. I mean, every audience knows.
There's pith all over the
table. Okay, Laura, I want to ask you this question about a comment that Lorenzo Thomas made, and he said poetry is a spiritual, social, and political revelation. Comment on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think his particular ability to mix those things fluidly, spiritual, social, political revelation, is reflected, to go back to you had mentioned Vietnam, is reflected in some of the ways that he, for instance, didn't, as Aldon said, write that much overtly about Vietnam, especially later in his career, the way someone like, Kumanyaka had done. You mentioned Kumanyaka, but the kind of intertwining of his political consciousness and criticism of, imperialism and things like that with spiritual, this really wide-ranging sense of spiritual influences and African cosmologies with kind of ancient mythologies with, social commentaries is all over his entire body of work from early on, as Aldon mentioned. And so, yeah, thinking about how some of the funny, light, satirical poems, as well as some of the kind of things we might think of as experimental or aesthetically kind of, out there poems, are intertwining all of those forces was key to how he was conceiving of poetry and of criticism, I think.
Mm-hmm. Both of you are teachers and critics, and I was wondering whether a book like this, The Collected Poems of Lorenzo Thomas, opens the door for more scholars doing papers on Lorenzo Thomas's work, more of other writers. I look at a book like this, and maybe members of Cave Canem, are passing it around because, all of Lorenzo's work is in one place. Do you see that as happening in the field?
Well, that's what we're doing programs like this for. Yes, I really, really hope it will have this effect. We had a pre-publication reading at St. Mark's Poetry Project up in New York about a year ago. It was very well attended. Both Laura and I are going to be in Philadelphia at Hiding Place Books. Anybody in Philadelphia listening online, on March 19, along with Margot Crawford and a couple of other people, Jack Crick, reading from this book. There's also going to be a reading at Cal State Los Angeles. I believe that's April 23rd. Anybody out there who might want to sponsor a reading around this book, what we try to do is bring a few local poets together to read from this book and talk about Lorenzo. And, we're doing everything we can to bring it to people's attention. In the past, we've seen the publication of a book like this can spark such interest. Mm-hmm. And so we're really hoping that people who didn't know of Lorenzo's work in the past will see this and get excited about it. I would point out, for example, the first three poems we've read are all poems that never appeared in any of his books. They were in journals and so forth. And the only place you can find them is in this Wesleyan publication that collected. So you really want to get out there and you want to get that book.
Yeah. I have here in the studio, I have Hoodoo 1 and 2 and 3. And these were publications that introduced me to Lorenzo Thomas's work. And, I was talking to Aldon before you came on the air. And I was talking about the relationship between Lorenzo Thomas and Amazu Bolton. And it wasn't because, it was because of your book, that in preparation for this show, I went back to look at the fact, and I didn't know this, that Amazu Bolton was almost like 10 years older.
Yeah, that shocked me when you told me.
Than Lorenzo Thomas. And I say that in terms of one of the things that you guys mentioned in the beginning was the whole thing in terms of a note to the text in terms of Lorenzo Thomas spelling words a certain way. And I remember Amazu Bolton also doing that. But I bring that question up to you guys in terms of one, now you're editing. Do you make these corrections? Do you put a little statement like this in there? And when do we know as editors that, well, this is just sloppy writing?
Yeah. Well, we had a hard time. Laura and I were sort of over email scratching our heads about some of these. What we decided in the end was, if the poem appeared more than twice the same way while Lorenzo was alive, we left it alone, except I think there was one or maybe two places where it was just obviously an error. I confess there's one bad typo in the book that we committed ourselves, but, readers can find that on their own. But yeah, part of this came from this whole process aesthetic that we get in the New American poetry. Some of it's quite deliberate, the way people spelled America with K's in the 60s and stuff like that. Some of it goes back to Pound and Cummings and experiments with letters and experiments with writing things phonetically. But in the end, since Lorenzo isn't with us anymore, we can't ask him. But as I said, the poems in the main part of the book appeared both in journals and in books, and he supervised the publication of those books. So we pretty much left punctuation and spelling the way he left it. Now, whether he meant to leave it that way or just didn't pay attention, I have no idea.
You mentioned that in some of his presentation, he spoke from note cards.
Yes.
I know that we have a book coming out, I think in March, the correspondence letters of Robert Creeley. Was Lorenzo Thomas the letter writer?
Since have never corresponded with anybody, I'm not actually sure about that. I'm sure prior to the internet, he probably wrote quite a few letters. Whether anyone saved them or not, I don't.
The reason I say that, you mentioned anyone who's in the military, might be writing letters back home.
Well, I'm sure Cecilio has quite a few.
Okay.
But again, you and I both know a lot of poets. I know poets who from the age of 15 were writing letters because they knew someday someone would collect them, right? Lorenzo wasn't that kind of person, but he was in correspondence with a lot of people. But that was again before email.
But what
days,
I was saying is sometimes the letter writer, and I look at Wanda Cohen was a letter writer. There are writers who may not write a lot, but when they sit down and write a letter, it's a letter. And for people like yourself and Laura, these become valuable documents.
They should. Like I said, I never write letters to anybody. Lorenzo and I, by the time we met, we were already in the email age. I'd been reading him for quite a long time, but we actually met maybe 1987 or so. So most of our correspondence was email, and we saw each other in person a lot. But yeah, obviously there is a lot of correspondence out there that's probably in individual people's hands if they had the foresight to save it. And it would be nice, maybe we can start putting out some notices and ask people if they have letters, think about going forward with something along those lines. But I haven't actually seen them. Laura,
I want to, as we get to the end of our show, and this is where you can be very open and honest. Okay. What happens many times, a person co-authors a book and there's a relationship, in terms of the two. Did you have any disagreement with Aldon around Lorenzo's work? And you have a half a minute to answer.
Exactly. Now, I think the only disagreements were the incredibly small ones that Aldon's alluding to about what kinds of editorial interventions did we feel comfortable making on the kind of typographical level of what was a an initial small press error versus how much was Thomas's intention that it was important to make sure was being preserved.
No, that's a very diplomatic response. but Laura Vrana, I hope I meet you in the future. My guest today has been Laura Vrana, who is an assistant professor of English specializing in African American literature and poetry at the University of South Alabama, and also Aldon Nielsen, who is the George and Barbara Kelly Professor of American Literature at the Pennsylvania State University. And we've been talking about this morning about their book, The Collected Poems of Lorenzo Thomas, was a University Press book, and I encourage you to seek it out. That's the end of this show. But before I actually leave, I hope that you think about making a pledge to WPFW. The number here is 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. And the station is WPFW 89.3 FM. The show's On the Margin. My name is Ethelbert Miller.
202-588-9739. Another stunning program by E. Ethelbert Miller and Company. Folks, we only need $451 and he will have made his goal. We're looking forward to hearing from you. We'd love to thank Alec in Greenbelt, Maryland. Thank you so much for going on the web and making the pledge. And thank you for Marcia, who from Washington, D.C., who says great program. And I agree with you. And if you agree with Marcia, please become a member supporter of this station. We are here only through your generosity. Lou Hill had a notion some 60 years ago that 80 years ago, that people will support something that they believe in, that they will invest their hard-earned dollars to keep an idea up, an ideal going. 202-588-9739, 1-800-222-9739 is the number for you to call to make sure that this idea of WPFW, of giving voice to the voiceless, of performing music live, of keeping jazz music alive. Again, it is not just news and music. It is jazz and justice here at WPFW. And it is poetry on the margin. E. Ethelbert Miller does his stunning job every Thursday, and it's something that you come to rely upon. We ask that you go to the phones and call. We only need $451 here in order for him to make his goal. Each show's assigned a specific amount of dollars that it has to make in order for the station to reach its overall goal. And again, the money comes back to you. None of the volunteers, Ethelbert, myself, other programmers that are here on the air, get paid. We are volunteers who give of time and talent and artistry to enhance your life in some way. And again, if you appreciate that, if you rely upon that, if this is your go-to on Thursdays, please don't delay any longer. $451 between now and 10 o'clock. 4 minutes remaining. It is easily achieved, but you have to go to the phone and you have to call. We are up to 100% of broadcast power right now. So we know there's lots of people out there who haven't been able to hear us and are hearing us now. If you appreciate that, please let us know. 202-588-9739. 1-800-222-9739. Please consider becoming a sustaining member. A sustaining member ensures that WPFW has a consistent stream of income. What you do is you agree to give us $10, $20, $100 a month, and we deduct that from your credit card or your bank account. And so if 4 people just made a pledge of $12.50, that would accumulate to $400. That's $600. That's $150 per pledge. At $600, will be well above the goal here that we need to set. 202-588-9739. 4 people who give us $12.50. That is a bagel and a coffee. That is a movie ticket. That is a couple hours parking fee. That if you take that same $12.50 and invest in the WPFW, that will ensure that Ethelbert will make his goal and that WPFW will continue to be here to provide you with the best in jazz and justice. Again, 202-588-9739. Please consider how you spend money other ways and think about investing that same money into the future of this station. So many people have done it before you to ensure that you can have it now. 202-588-9739. 1-800-222-9739. This is a community effort. Ethelbert has come in here and has programmed a really wonderful show that you're able to enjoy. Aldon and Lauren have called in, or Aldon is actually here in person, and have provided information and insight to Lorenzo Thomas. 202 588-9739. We have 2 minutes remaining, waiting to hear from you. Please call.
Hey, WPFW family, this is Mazi Mutafa from Live at 5 on Wednesdays. It's hard to believe that spring is just around the corner, and this spring, Words Beats and Life will be hosting its 3rd annual Fresh Ball, a night of hip-hop karaoke with special performances from Camp Low, Kamau, DJ RBI, and the Groove Junkies. There'll be international food served, along with a coronation of the 2 freshest dressed guests. It's all happening at the City Winery on Thursday, March the 26th. For tickets and more information, visit thefreshball.com. This event is a fundraiser for Words Beats and Life, a hip-hop nonprofit.
The theme for International Women's Day 2020 is an equal world is an enabled world. Equality is not a women's issue, it's a human issue. Gender equality is essential for all of us to thrive. Listen to WPFW from midnight until midnight, Sunday, March 8th, as we celebrate the contribution of women and girls around the planet. The programming will also explore